main trouble from which they suffer is primitive production methods, which are both a cause and a consequence of a shortage of capital, and not unemployment. Nothing is easier to achieve than full employment, once it is divorced from the goal of full production and taken as an end in itself. Hitler provided full employment with a huge armament program. World War II provided full employment for every nation involved. The slave labor in Germany had full employment. Prisons and chain gangs have full employment. Coercion can always provide full employment. Yet our legislators do not present full production bills in Congress, but full employment bills. Even committees of businessmen recommend a president's commission on full employment, not on full production, or even on full employment and full production. Everywhere the means is erected into the end, and the end itself is forgotten. Wages and employment are discussed as if they had no relation to productivity and output. On the assumption that there is only a fixed amount of work to be done, the conclusion is drawn that a 30-hour week will provide more jobs and will therefore be preferable to a 40-hour week. 100 make-work practices of labor unions are confusedly tolerated. When a Petrillo threatens to put a radio station out of business unless it employs twice as many musicians as it needs, he is supported by part of the public because he is, after all, merely trying to create jobs. When we had our WPA, it was considered a mark of genius for the administrators to think of projects that employed the largest number of men in relation to the value of the work performed. In other words, in which labor was least efficient. It would be far better, if that were the choice, which it isn't, to have maximum production with part of the population supported in idleness by undisguised relief, than to provide full employment by so many forms of disguised make-work that production is disorganized. The progress of civilization has meant the reduction of employment, not its increase. It is because we have become increasingly wealthy as a nation that we have been able virtually to eliminate child labor, to remove the necessity of work for many of the aged, and to make it unnecessary for millions of women to take jobs. A much smaller proportion of the American population needs to work than that, say, of China or of Russia. The real question is not how many millions of jobs there will be in America 10 years from now, but how much shall we produce, and what, in consequence, will be our standard of living. The problem of distribution, on which all the stress is being put today, is, after all, more easily solved the more there is to distribute. We can clarify our thinking if we put our chief emphasis where it belongs, on policies that will maximize production. Chapter 11. Who's protected by tariffs? A mere recital of the economic policies of governments all over the world is calculated to cause any serious student of economics to throw up his hands in despair. What possible point can there be, he is likely to ask, in discussing refinements and advances in economic theory, when popular thought and the actual policies of governments, certainly in everything connected with international relations, have not yet caught up with Adam Smith? For present-day tariff and trade policies are not only as bad as those in the 17th and 18th centuries, but incomparably worse. The real reasons for those tariffs and other trade barriers are the same, and the pretended reasons are also the same. Since the wealth of nations appeared more than 2 centuries ago, the case for free trade has been stated thousands of times, but perhaps never with more direct simplicity and force than it was stated in that volume. In general, Smith rested his case on one fundamental proposition. In every country, it always is and must be the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest. The proposition is so very manifest, Smith continued, that it seems ridiculous to take any pains to prove it. Nor could it ever have been called in question had not the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers confounded the common sense of mankind. From another point of view, free trade was considered as one aspect of the specialization of labor. It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. The tailor does not attempt to make his own shoes, but buys them of the shoemaker. The shoemaker does not attempt to make his own clothes, but employs a tailor. The farmer attempts to make neither the one nor the other, but employs those different artificers. All of them find it for their interest to employ their whole industry in a way in which they have some advantage over their neighbors, and to purchase with a part of its produce, or what is the same thing, with the price of a part of it, whatever else they have occasion for. What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. But whatever led people to suppose that what was prudence in the conduct of every private family could be folly in that of a great kingdom? It was a whole network of fallacies, out of which mankind has still been unable to cut its way. And the chief of them was the central fallacy with which this book is concerned. It was that of considering merely the immediate effects of a tariff on special groups, and neglecting to consider its long-run effects on the whole community. 2. An American manufacturer of woolen sweaters goes to Congress or the State Department and tells the committee or officials concerned that it would be a national disaster for them to remove or reduce the tariff on British sweaters. He now sells his sweaters for $30 each, but English manufacturers could sell their sweaters of the same quality for $25. A duty of $5, therefore, is needed to keep him in business. He is not thinking of himself, of course, but of the 1,000 men and women he employs, and of the people to whom their spending in turn gives employment. Throw them out of work, and you create unemployment and a fall in purchasing power, which would spread in ever-widening circles. And if he can prove that he really would be forced out of business if the tariff were removed or reduced, his argument against that action is regarded by Congress as conclusive. But the fallacy comes from looking merely at this manufacturer and his employees, or merely at the American sweater industry. It comes from noticing only the results that are immediately seen, and neglecting the results that are not seen because they are prevented from coming into existence. The lobbyists for tariff protection are continually putting forward arguments that are not factually correct. But let us assume that the facts in this case are precisely as the sweater manufacturer has stated them. Let us assume that a tariff of $5 a sweater is necessary for him to stay in business and provide employment at sweater making for his workers. We have deliberately chosen the most unfavorable example of any for the removal of a tariff. We have not taken an argument for the imposition of a new tariff in order to bring a new industry into existence, but an argument for the retention of a tariff that has already brought an industry into existence and cannot be repealed without hurting somebody. The tariff is repealed. The manufacturer goes out of business. 1,000 workers are laid off. The particular tradesmen whom they patronized are hurt. This is the immediate result that is seen. But there are also results which, while much more difficult to trace, are no less immediate and no less real. For now, sweaters that formerly cost retail $30 apiece can be bought for $25. Consumers can now buy the same quality of sweater for less money, or a much better one for the same money. If they buy the same quality of sweater, they not only get the sweater, but they have $5 left over, which they would not have had under the previous conditions, to buy something else. With the $25 that they pay for the imported sweater, they help employment, as the American manufacturer no doubt predicted in the sweater industry in England. With the $5 left over, they help employment in any number of other industries in the United States. But the results do not end there. By buying English sweaters, they furnish the English with dollars to buy American goods here. This, in fact, if I may here disregard such complications as fluctuating exchange rates, loans, credits, etc., is the only way in which the British can eventually make use of these dollars. Because we have permitted the British to sell more to us, they are now able to buy more from us. They are, in fact, eventually forced to buy more from us if their dollar balances are not to remain perpetually unused. So, as a result of letting in more British goods, we must export more American goods. And though fewer people are now employed in the American sweater industry, more people are employed, and much more efficiently employed, in, say, the American washing machine or aircraft building business. American employment on net balance has not gone down, but American and British production on net balance has gone up. Labor in each country is more fully employed in doing just those things that it does best, instead of being forced to do things that it does inefficiently or badly. Consumers in both countries are better off. They are able to buy what they want where they can get it cheapest. American consumers are better provided with sweaters, and British consumers are better provided with washing machines and aircraft. 3. Now let us look at the matter the other way round, and see the effect of imposing a tariff in the first place. Suppose that there had been no tariff on foreign knit goods, that Americans were accustomed to buying foreign sweaters without duty, and that the argument were then put forward that we could bring a sweater industry into existence by imposing a duty of $5 on sweaters. There would be nothing logically wrong with this argument so far as it went. The cost of British sweaters to the American consumer might thereby be forced so high that American manufacturers would find it profitable to enter the sweater business. But American consumers would be forced to subsidize this industry. On every American sweater they bought, they would be forced, in effect, to pay a tax of $5, which would be collected from them in a higher price by the new sweater industry. Americans would be employed in a sweater industry who had not previously been employed in a sweater industry. That much is true. But there would be no net addition to the country's industry or the country's employment. Because the American consumer had to pay $5 more for the same quality of sweater, he would have just that much less left over to buy anything else. He would have to reduce his expenditures by $5 somewhere else. In order that one industry might grow or come into existence, 100 other industries would have to shrink. In order that 50,000 persons might be employed in a woolen sweater industry, 50,000 fewer persons would be employed elsewhere. But the new industry would be visible. The number of its employees, the capital invested in it, the market value of its product in terms of dollars could be easily counted. The neighbors could see the sweater workers going to and from the factory every day. The results would be palpable and direct. But the shrinkage of 100 other industries, the loss of 50,000 other jobs somewhere else, would not be so easily noticed. It would be impossible for even the cleverest statistician to know precisely what the incidence of the loss of other jobs had been, precisely how many men and women had been laid off from each particular industry, precisely how much business each particular industry had lost, because consumers had to pay more for their sweaters. For a loss spread among all the other productive activities of the country would be comparatively minute for each. It would be impossible for anyone to know precisely how each consumer would have spent his extra $5 if he had been allowed to retain it. The overwhelming majority of the people, therefore, would probably suffer from the illusion that the new industry had cost us nothing. 4. It is important to notice that the new tariff on sweaters would not raise American wages. To be sure, it would enable Americans to work in the sweater industry at approximately the average level of American wages for workers of their skill, instead of having to compete in that industry at the British level of wages. But there would be no increase of American wages in general as a result of the duty. For, as we have seen, there would be no net increase in the number of jobs provided, no net increase in the demand for goods, and no increase in labor productivity. Labor productivity would, in fact, be reduced as a result of the tariff. And this brings us to the real effect of a tariff wall. It is not merely that all its visible gains are offset by less obvious but no less real losses. It results, in fact, in a net loss to the country. For contrary to centuries of interested propaganda and disinterested confusion, the tariff reduces the American level of wages. Let us observe more clearly how it does this. We have seen that the added amount which consumers pay for a tariff-protected article leaves them just that much less with which to buy all other articles. There is here no net gain to industry as a whole. But as a result of the artificial barrier erected against foreign goods, American labor, capital, and land are deflected from what they can do more efficiently to what they do less efficiently. Therefore, as a result of the tariff wall, the average productivity of American labor and capital is reduced. If we look at it now from the consumer's point of view, we find that he can buy less with his money. Because he has to pay more for sweaters and other protected goods, he can buy less of everything else. The general purchasing power of his income has therefore been reduced. Whether the net effect of the tariff is to lower money wages or to raise money prices will depend upon the monetary policies that are followed. But what is clear is that the tariff, though it may increase wages above what they would have been in the protected industries, must on net balance, when all occupations are considered, reduce real wages. Reduce them, that is to say, compared with what they otherwise would have been. Only minds corrupted by generations of misleading propaganda can regard this conclusion as paradoxical. What other result could we expect from a policy of deliberately using our resources of capital and manpower in less efficient ways than we know how to use them? What other result could we expect from deliberately erecting artificial obstacles to trade and transportation? For the erection of tariff walls has the same effect as the erection of real walls. It is significant that the protectionists habitually use the language of warfare. They talk of repelling an invasion of foreign products, and the means they suggest in the fiscal field are like those of the battlefield. The tariff barriers that are put up to repel this invasion are like the tank traps, trenches, and barbed wire entanglements created to repel or slow down attempted invasion by a foreign army. And just as the foreign army is compelled to employ more expensive means to surmount those obstacles, bigger tanks, mine detectors, engineer corps to cut wires, ford streams, and build bridges, so more expensive and efficient transportation means must be developed to surmount tariff obstacles. On the one hand, we try to reduce the cost of transportation between England and America, or Canada and the United States, by developing faster and more efficient planes and ships, better roads and bridges, better locomotives and motor trucks. On the other hand, we offset this investment in efficient transportation by a tariff that makes it commercially even more difficult to transport goods than it was before. We make it $1 cheaper to ship the sweaters, and then increase the tariff by $2 to prevent the sweaters from being shipped. By reducing the freight that can be profitably carried, we reduce the value of the investment in transport efficiency. 5. The tariff has been described as a means of benefiting the producer at the expense of the consumer. In a sense, this is correct. Those who favor it think only of the interests of the producers immediately benefited by the particular duties involved. They forget the interests of the consumers, who are immediately injured by being forced to pay these duties. But it is wrong to think of the tariff issue as if it represented a conflict between the interests of producers as a unit against those of consumers as a unit. It is true that the tariff hurts all consumers as such. It is not true that it benefits all producers as such. On the contrary, as we have just seen, it helps the protected producers at the expense of all other American producers, and particularly of those who have a comparatively large potential export market. We can perhaps make this last point clearer by an exaggerated example. Suppose we make our tariff wall so high that it becomes absolutely prohibitive, and no imports come in from the outside world at all. Suppose, as a result of this, that the price of sweaters in America goes up only $5. Then American consumers, because they have to pay $5 more for a sweater, will spend on the average 5 cents less in each of 100 other American industries. The figures are chosen merely to illustrate a principle. There will, of course, be no such symmetrical distribution of the loss. Moreover, the sweater industry itself will doubtless be hurt because of protection of still other industries. But these complications may be put aside for the moment. Now, because foreign industries will find their market in America totally cut off, they will get no dollar exchange, and therefore they will be unable to buy any American goods at all. As a result of this, American industries will suffer in direct proportion to the percentage of their sales previously made abroad. Those that will be most injured in the first instance will be such industries as raw cotton producers, copper producers, makers of sewing machines, agricultural machinery, typewriters, commercial airplanes, and so on. A higher tariff wall, which, however, is not prohibitive, will produce the same kind of results as this, but merely to a smaller degree. The effect of a tariff, therefore, is to change the structure of American production. It changes the number of occupations, the kind of occupations, and the relative size of one industry as compared with another. It makes the industries in which we are comparatively inefficient larger, and the industries in which we are comparatively efficient smaller. Its net effect, therefore, is to reduce American efficiency, as well as to reduce efficiency in the countries with which we would otherwise have traded more largely. In the long run, notwithstanding the mountains of argument pro and con, a tariff is irrelevant to the question of employment. True, sudden changes in the tariff, either upward or downward, can create temporary unemployment, as they force corresponding changes in the structure of production. Such sudden changes can even cause a depression. But a tariff is not irrelevant to the question of wages. In the long run, it always reduces real wages, because it reduces efficiency, production, and wealth. Thus, all the chief tariff fallacies stem from the central fallacy with which this book is concerned. They are the result of looking only at the immediate effects of a single tariff rate on one group of producers, and forgetting the long-run effects both on consumers as a whole and on all other producers. I hear some reader asking, why not solve this by giving tariff protection to all producers? But the fallacy here is that this cannot help producers uniformly, and cannot help at all domestic producers who already outsell foreign producers. These efficient producers must necessarily suffer from the diversion of purchasing power brought about by the tariff. 6. On the subject of the tariff, we must keep in mind one final precaution. It is the same precaution that we found necessary in examining the effects of machinery. It is useless to deny that a tariff does benefit, or at least can benefit, special interests. True, it benefits them at the expense of everyone else, but it does benefit them. If one industry alone could get protection, while its owners and workers enjoyed the benefits of free trade in everything else they bought, that industry would benefit even on net balance. As an attempt is made to extend the tariff blessings, however, even people in the protected industries, both as producers and consumers, begin to suffer from other people's protection, and may finally be worse off even on net balance than if neither they nor anybody else had protection. But we should not deny, as enthusiastic free traders have so often done, the possibility of these tariff benefits to special groups. We should not pretend, for example, that a reduction of the tariff would help everybody and hurt nobody. It is true that its reduction would help the country on net balance, but somebody would be hurt. That, in fact, is one reason why it is not good to bring such protected interests into existence in the first place. But clarity and candor of thinking compel us to see and acknowledge that some industries are right when they say that a removal of the tariff on their product would throw them out of business, and throw their workers, at least temporarily, out of jobs. And if their workers have developed specialized skills, they may even suffer permanently, or until they have at long last learnt equal skills. In tracing the effects of tariffs, as in tracing the effects of machinery, we should endeavor to see all the chief effects, in both the short run and the long run, on all groups. As a postscript to this chapter, I should add that its argument is not directed against all tariffs, including duties collected mainly for revenue, or to keep alive industries needed for war. Nor is it directed against all arguments for tariffs. It is merely directed against the fallacy that a tariff on net balance provides employment, raises wages, or protects the American standard of living. It does none of these things, and so far as wages and the standard of living are concerned, it does the precise opposite. But an examination of duties imposed for other purposes would carry us beyond our present subject. Nor need we here examine the effect of import quotas, exchange controls, bilateralism, and other means of reducing, diverting, or preventing international trade. Such devices have, in general, the same effects as high or prohibitive tariffs, and often worse effects. They present more complicated issues. but their net results can be traced through the same kind of reasoning that we have just applied to tariff barriers. Chapter 12. The Drive for Exports. Exceeded only by the pathological dread of imports that affects all nations is a pathological yearning for exports. Logically, it is true, nothing could be more inconsistent. In the long run, imports and exports must equal each other, considering both in the broadest sense, which includes such invisible items as tourist expenditures, ocean freight charges, and all other items in the balance of payments. It is exports that pay for imports, and vice versa. The greater exports we have, the greater imports we must have, if we ever expect to get paid. The smaller imports we have, the smaller exports we can have. Without imports we can have no exports, for foreigners will have no funds with which to buy our goods. When we decide to cut down our imports, we are, in effect, deciding also to cut down our exports. When we decide to increase our exports, we are, in effect, deciding also to increase our imports. The reason for this is elementary. An American exporter sells his goods to a British importer and is paid in British pounds sterling. But he cannot use British pounds to pay the wages of his workers, to buy his wife's clothes, or to buy theater tickets. For all these purposes he needs American dollars. Therefore his British pounds are of no use to him unless he either uses them himself to buy British goods, or sells them, through his bank or other agent, to some American importer who wishes to use them to buy British goods. Whichever he does, the transaction cannot be completed until the American exports have been paid for by an equal amount of imports. The same situation would exist if the transaction had been conducted in terms of American dollars instead of British pounds. The British importer could not pay the American exporter in dollars unless some previous British exporter had built up a credit in dollars here as a result of some previous sale to us. Foreign exchange, in short, is a clearing transaction in which, in America, the dollar debts of foreigners are canceled against their dollar credits. In England, the pound sterling debts of foreigners are canceled against their sterling credits. There is no reason to go into the technical details of all this, which can be found in any good textbook on foreign exchange. But it should be pointed out that there is nothing inherently mysterious about it, in spite of the mystery in which it is so often wrapped, and that it does not differ essentially from what happens in domestic trade. Each of us must also sell something, even if, for most of us, it is our own services rather than goods, in order to get the purchasing power to buy. Domestic trade is also conducted in the main by crossing off checks and other claims against each other through clearinghouses. It is true that under the international gold standard, discrepancies in balances of imports and exports were sometimes settled by shipments of gold, but they could just as well have been settled by shipments of cotton, steel, whiskey, perfume, or any other commodity. The chief difference is that when a gold standard exists, the demand for gold is almost indefinitely expansible, partly because it is thought of and accepted as a residual international money rather than as just another commodity, and that nations do not put artificial obstacles in the way of receiving gold as they do in the way of receiving almost everything else. On the other hand, of late years they have taken to putting more obstacles in the way of exporting gold than in the way of exporting anything else, but that is another story. Now, the same people who can be clear-headed and sensible when the subject is one of domestic trade can be incredibly emotional and muddle-headed when it becomes one of foreign trade. In the latter field they can seriously advocate or acquiesce in principles which they would think it insane to apply in domestic business. A typical example is the belief that the government should make huge loans to foreign countries for the sake of increasing our exports, regardless of whether or not these loans are likely to be repaid. American citizens, of course, should be allowed to lend their own funds abroad at their own risk. The government should put no arbitrary barriers in the way of private lending to countries with which we are at peace. As individuals, we should be willing to give generously, for humane reasons alone, to people who are in great distress or in danger of starving. But we ought always to know clearly what we are doing. It is not wise to bestow charity on foreign people under the impression that one is making a hard-headed business transaction purely for one's own selfish purposes. That could only lead to misunderstandings and bad relations later. Yet, among the arguments put forward in favor of huge foreign lending, one fallacy is always sure to occupy a prominent place. It runs like this: even if half or all the loans we make to foreign countries turn sour and are not repaid, this nation will still be better off for having made them, because they will give an enormous impetus to our exports. It should be immediately obvious that if the loans we make to foreign countries to enable them to buy our goods are not repaid, then we are giving the goods away. A nation cannot grow rich by giving goods away. It can only make itself poorer. No one doubts this proposition when it is applied privately. If an automobile company lends a man $5,000 to buy a car priced at that amount, and the loan is not repaid, the automobile company is not better off because it has sold the car. It has simply lost the amount that it cost to make the car. If the car cost $4,000 to make, and only half the loan is repaid, then the company has lost $4,000 minus $2,500. Or a net amount of $1,500. It has not made up in trade what it lost in bad loans. If this proposition is so simple when applied to a private company, why do apparently intelligent people get confused about it when applied to a nation? The reason is that the transaction must then be traced mentally through a few more stages. One group may indeed make gains, while the rest of us take the losses. It is true, for example, that persons engaged exclusively or chiefly in export business might gain on net balance as a result of bad loans made abroad. The national loss on the transaction would be certain, but it might be distributed in ways difficult to follow. The private lenders would take their losses directly. The losses from government lending would ultimately be paid out of increased taxes imposed on everybody. But there would also be many indirect losses brought about by the effect on the economy of these direct losses. In the long run, business and employment in America would be hurt, not helped, by foreign loans that were not repaid. For every extra dollar that foreign buyers had with which to buy American goods, domestic buyers would ultimately have $1 less. Businesses that depend on domestic trade would therefore be hurt in the long run as much as export businesses would be helped. Even many concerns that did an export business would be hurt on net balance. American automobile companies, for example, sold about 15% of their output in the foreign market in 1975. It would not profit them to sell 20% of their output abroad as a result of bad foreign loans if they thereby lost, say, 10% of their American sales as the result of added taxes taken from American buyers to make up for the unpaid foreign loans. None of this means, I repeat, that it is unwise for private investors to make loans abroad, but simply that we cannot get rich by making bad ones. For the same reasons that it is stupid to give a false stimulation to export trade by making bad loans or outright gifts to foreign countries, it is stupid to give a false stimulation to export trade through export subsidies. An export subsidy is a clear case of giving the foreigner something for nothing, by selling him goods for less than it costs us to make them. It is another case of trying to get rich by giving things away. In the face of all this, the United States government has been engaged for years in a foreign economic aid program, the greater part of which has consisted in outright government-to-government gifts of many billions of dollars. Here we are interested in just one aspect of that program: the naive belief of many of its sponsors that this is a clever or even a necessary method of increasing our exports, and so maintaining prosperity and employment. It is still another form of the delusion that a nation can get rich by giving things away. What conceals the truth from many supporters of the program is that what is directly given away is not the exports themselves, but the money with which to buy them. It is possible, therefore, for individual exporters to profit on net balance from the national loss, if their individual profit from the exports is greater than their share of taxes to pay for the program. Here we have simply one more example of the error of looking only at the immediate effect of a policy on some special group, and of not having the patience or intelligence to trace the long-run effects of the policy on everyone. If we do trace these long-run effects on everyone, we come to an additional conclusion: the exact opposite of the doctrine that has dominated the thinking of most government officials for centuries. This is, as John Stuart Mill so clearly pointed out, that the real gain of foreign trade to any country lies not in its exports, but in its imports. Its consumers are either able to get from abroad commodities at a lower price than they could obtain them for at home, or commodities that they could not get from domestic producers at all. Outstanding examples in the United States are coffee and tea. Collectively considered, the real reason a country needs exports is to pay for its imports. Chapter 13. Parity Prices. Special interests, as the history of tariffs reminds us, can think of the most ingenious reasons why they should be the objects of special solicitude. Their spokesmen present a plan in their favor, and it seems at first so absurd that disinterested writers do not trouble to expose it. But the special interests keep on insisting on the scheme. Its enactment would make so much difference to their own immediate welfare that they can afford to hire trained economists and public relations experts to propagate it in their behalf. The public hears the argument so often repeated, and accompanied by such a wealth of imposing statistics, charts, curves, and pie slices, that it is soon taken in. When at last disinterested writers recognize that the danger of the scheme's enactment is real, they are usually too late. They cannot in a few weeks acquaint themselves with the subject as thoroughly as the hired brains who have been devoting their full time to it for years. They are accused of being uninformed, and they have the air of men who presume to dispute axioms. This general history will do as a history of the idea of parity prices for agricultural products. I forget the first day when it made its appearance in a legislative bill, but with the advent of the New Deal in 1933, it had become a definitely established principle, enacted into law. And as year succeeded year, and its absurd corollaries made themselves manifest, they were enacted too. The argument for parity prices ran roughly like this: agriculture is the most basic and important of all industries. It must be preserved at all costs. Moreover, the prosperity of everybody else depends upon the prosperity of the farmer. If he does not have the purchasing power to buy the products of industry, industry languishes. This was the cause of the 1929 collapse, or at least of our failure to recover from it. For the prices of farm products dropped violently, while the prices of industrial products dropped very little. The result was that the farmer could not buy industrial products. The city workers were laid off and could not buy farm products, and the depression spread in ever-widening vicious circles. There was only one cure, and it was simple: bring back the prices of the farmer's products to a parity with the prices of the things the farmer buys. This parity existed in the period from 1909 to 1914, when farmers were prosperous. That price relationship must be restored and preserved perpetually. It would take too long and carry us too far from our main point to examine every absurdity concealed in this plausible statement. There is no sound reason for taking the particular price relationships that prevailed in a particular year or period and regarding them as sacrosanct, or even as necessarily more normal than those of any other period. Even if they were normal at the time, what reason is there to suppose that these same relationships should be preserved more than 60 years later, in spite of the enormous changes in the conditions of production and demand that have taken place in the meantime? The period of 1909 to 1914, as the basis of parity, was not selected at random. In terms of relative prices, it was one of the most favorable periods to agriculture in our entire history. If there had been any sincerity or logic in the idea, it would have been universally extended. If the price relationships between agricultural and industrial products that prevailed from August 1909 to July 1914 ought to be preserved perpetually, why not preserve perpetually the price relationship of every commodity at that time to every other? When the first edition of this book appeared in 1946, I used the following illustrations of the absurdities to which this would have led. A Chevrolet six-cylinder touring car cost $2,150 in 1912. An incomparably improved six-cylinder Chevrolet sedan cost $907 in 1942. Adjusted for parity on the same basis as farm products, however, it would have cost $3,270 in 1942. A pound of aluminum from 1909 to 1913 inclusive averaged 22.5 cents. Its price early in 1946 was 14 cents. But at parity, it would then have cost, instead, 41 cents. It would be both difficult and debatable to try to bring these two particular comparisons down to date by adjusting not only for the serious inflation — consumer prices have more than tripled between 1946 and 1978 — but also for the qualitative differences in automobiles in the two periods. But this difficulty merely emphasizes the impracticability of the proposal. After making in the 1946 edition the comparison quoted above, I went on to point out that the same type of increase in productivity had in part led also to the lower prices of farm products. In the 5-year period 1955 through 1959, an average of 428 pounds of cotton was raised per acre in the United States, as compared with an average of 260 pounds in the 5-year period 1939 to 1943, and an average of only 188 pounds in the 5-year base period 1909 to 1913. When these comparisons are brought down to date, they show that the increase in farm productivity has continued, though at a reduced rate. In the 5-year period 1968 to 1972, an average of 467 pounds of cotton was raised per acre. Similarly, in the 5 years 1968 to 1972, an average of 84 bushels of corn per acre was raised, compared with an average of only 26.1 bushels in 1935 to 1939, and an average of 31.3 bushels of wheat was raised per acre, compared with an average of only 13.2 in the earlier period. Costs of production have been substantially lowered for farm products by better application of chemical fertilizer, improved strains of seed, and increasing mechanization. In the 1946 edition, I made the following quotation. On some large farms which have been completely mechanized and are operated along mass production lines, it requires only 1/3 to 1/5 the amount of labor to produce the same yields as it did a few years back. Yet all this is ignored by the apostles of parity prices. The refusal to universalize the principle is not the only evidence that it is not a public-spirited economic plan, but merely a device for subsidizing a special interest. Another evidence is that when agricultural prices go above parity, or are forced there by government policies, there is no demand on the part of the farm bloc in Congress that such prices be brought down to parity, or that the subsidy be to that extent repaid. It is a rule that works only one way. 2. Dismissing all these considerations, let us return to the central fallacy that specially concerns us here. This is the argument that if the farmer gets higher prices for his products, he can buy more goods from industry, and so make industry prosperous and bring full employment. It does not matter to this argument, of course, whether or not the farmer gets specifically so-called parity prices. Everything, however, depends on how these higher prices are brought about. If they are the result of a general revival, if they follow from increased prosperity of business, increased industrial production, and increased purchasing power of city workers, not brought about by inflation, then they can indeed mean increased prosperity and production not only for the farmers, but for everyone. But what we are discussing is a rise in farm prices brought about by government intervention. This can be done in several ways. The higher price can be forced by mere edict, which is the least workable method. It can be brought about by the government standing ready to buy all the farm products offered to it at the parity price. It can be brought about by the government's lending to farmers enough money on their crops to enable them to hold the crops off the market until parity or a higher price is realized. It can be brought about by the government's enforcing restrictions in the size of crops. It can be brought about, as it often is in practice, by a combination of these methods. For the moment, we shall simply assume that by whatever method, it is in any case brought about. What is the result? The farmers get higher prices for their crops. In spite of reduced production, say, their purchasing power is thereby increased. They are, for the time being, more prosperous themselves, and they buy more of the products of industry. All this is what is seen by those who look merely at the immediate consequences of policies to the groups directly involved. But there is another consequence, no less inevitable. Suppose the wheat, which would otherwise sell at $2.50 a bushel, is pushed up by this policy to $3.50. The farmer gets $1 a bushel more for wheat. But the city worker, by precisely the same change, pays $1 a bushel more for wheat in an increased price of bread. The same thing is true of any other farm product. If the farmer then has $1 more purchasing power to buy industrial products, the city worker has precisely that much less purchasing power to buy industrial products. On net balance, industry in general has gained nothing. It loses in city sales precisely as much as it gains in rural sales. There is, of course, a change in the incidence of these sales. No doubt the agricultural implement makers and the mail-order houses do a better business, but the city department stores do a smaller business. The matter, however, does not end there. The policy results not merely in no net gain, but in a net loss. For it does not mean merely a transfer of purchasing power to the farmer from city consumers, or from the general taxpayer, or from both. It also frequently means a forced cut in the production of farm commodities to bring up the price. This means a destruction of wealth. It means that there is less food to be consumed. How this destruction of wealth is brought about will depend upon the particular method pursued to bring prices up. It may mean the actual physical destruction of what has already been produced, as in the burning of coffee in Brazil. It may mean a forced restriction of acreage, as in the American AAA plan, or its revival. We shall examine the effect of some of these methods when we come to the broader discussion of government commodity controls. But here it may be pointed out that when the farmer reduces the production of wheat to get parity, he may indeed get a higher price for each bushel, but he produces and sells fewer bushels. The result is that his income does not go up in proportion to his prices. Even some of the advocates of parity prices recognize this and use it as an argument to go on to insist upon parity income for farmers. But this can only be achieved by a subsidy at the direct expense of taxpayers. To help the farmers, in other words, it merely reduces the purchasing power of city workers and other groups still more. 3. There is one argument for parity prices that should be dealt with before we leave the subject. It is put forward by some of the more sophisticated defenders. Yes, they will freely admit, the economic arguments for parity prices are unsound. Such prices are a special privilege. They are an imposition on the consumer. But isn't the tariff an imposition on the farmer? Doesn't he have to pay higher prices on industrial products because of it? It would do no good to place a compensating tariff on farm products because America is a net exporter of farm products. Now the parity price system is the farmer's equivalent of the tariff. It is the only fair way to even things up. The farmers that asked for parity prices did have a legitimate complaint. The protective tariff injured them more than they knew. By reducing industrial imports, it also reduced American farm exports because it prevented foreign nations from getting the dollar exchange needed for taking our agricultural products. And it provoked retaliatory tariffs in other countries. Nonetheless, the argument we have just quoted will not stand examination. It is wrong even in its implied statement of the facts. There is no general tariff on all industrial products or on all non-farm products. There are scores of domestic industries or of exporting industries that have no tariff protection. If the city worker has to pay a higher price for woolen blankets or overcoats because of a tariff, is he compensated by having to pay a higher price also for cotton clothing and for foodstuffs? Or is he merely being robbed twice? Let us even it all out, say some, by giving equal protection to everybody. But that is insoluble and impossible. Even if we assume that the problem could be solved technically, a tariff for A, an industrialist subject to foreign competition, a subsidy for B, an industrialist who exports his product, it would be impossible to protect or to subsidize everybody fairly or equally. We should have to give everyone the same percentage, or would it be the same dollar amount, of tariff protection or subsidy, and we could never be sure when we were duplicating payments to some groups or leaving gaps with others. But suppose we could solve this fantastic problem. What would be the point? Who gains when everyone equally subsidizes everyone else? What is the profit when everyone loses in added taxes precisely what he gains by his subsidy or his protection? We should merely have added an army of needless bureaucrats to carry out the program, with all of them lost to production. We could solve the matter simply, on the other hand, by ending both the parity price system and the protective tariff system. Meanwhile, they do not, in combination, even out anything. The joint system means merely that farmer A and industrialist B both profit at the expense of forgotten man C. So the alleged benefits of still another scheme evaporate as soon as we trace not only its immediate effects on a special group, but its long-run effects on everyone. Chapter 14. Saving the X Industry. The lobbies of Congress are crowded with representatives of the X industry. The X industry is sick. The X industry is dying. It must be saved. It can be saved only by a tariff, by higher prices, or by a subsidy. If it is allowed to die, workers will be thrown on the streets. Their landlords, grocers, butchers, clothing stores, and local motion pictures will lose business, and depression will spread in ever-widening circles. But if the X industry, by prompt action of Congress, is saved, then it will buy equipment from other industries. More men will be employed. They will give more business to the butchers, bakers, and neon light makers. And then it is prosperity that will spread in ever-widening circles. It is obvious that this is merely a generalized form of the case we have just been considering. There, the X industry was agriculture, but there is an endless number of X industries. Two of the most notable examples have been the coal and silver industries. To save silver, Congress did immense harm. One of the arguments for the rescue plan was that it would help the East. One of its actual results was to cause deflation in China, which had been on a silver basis, and to force China off that basis. The United States Treasury was compelled to acquire, at ridiculous prices far above the market level, hordes of unnecessary silver and to store it in vaults. The essential political aims of the silver senators could have been as well achieved, at a fraction of the harm and cost, by the payment of a frank subsidy to the mine owners or to their workers. But Congress and the country would never have approved a naked steal of this sort, unaccompanied by the ideological flim-flam regarding silver's essential role in the national currency. To save the coal industry, Congress passed the Guffey Act, under which the owners of coal mines were not only permitted, but compelled to conspire together not to sell below certain minimum prices fixed by the government. Though Congress had started out to fix the price of coal, the government soon found itself, because of different sizes, thousands of mines, and shipments to thousands of different destinations by rail, truck, ship, and barge, fixing 350,000 separate prices for coal. One effect of this attempt to keep coal prices above the competitive market level was to accelerate the tendency toward the substitution by consumers of other sources of power or heat, such as oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric energy. Today, we find the government trying to force conversion from oil consumption back to coal. 2. Our aim here is not to trace all the results that followed historically from efforts to save particular industries, but to trace a few of the chief results that must necessarily follow from efforts to save an industry. It may be argued that a given industry must be created or preserved for military reasons. It may be argued that a given industry is being ruined by taxes or wage rates disproportionate to those of other industries. Or that, if a public utility, it is being forced to operate at rates or charges to the public that do not permit an adequate profit margin. Such arguments may or may not be justified in a particular case. We are not concerned with them here. We are concerned only with a single argument for saving the X industry, that if it is allowed to shrink in size or perish through the forces of free competition, always called by spokesmen for the industry in such cases laissez-faire, anarchic, cutthroat, dog-eat-dog, law of the jungle competition. It will pull down the general economy with it, and that if it is artificially kept alive, it will help everybody else. What we are talking about here is nothing else but a generalized case of the argument put forward for parity prices for farm products, or for tariff protection for any number of X industries. The argument against artificially higher prices applies, of course, not only to farm products, but to any product, just as the reasons we have found for opposing tariff protection for one industry apply to any other. But there are always any number of schemes for saving X industries. There are two main types of such proposals in addition to those we have already considered, and we shall take a brief glance at them. One is to contend that the X industry is already overcrowded, and to try to prevent other firms or workers from getting into it. The other is to argue that the X industry needs to be supported by a direct subsidy from the government. Now, if the X industry is really overcrowded, as compared with other industries, it will not need any coercive legislation to keep out new capital or new workers. New capital does not rush into industries that are obviously dying. Investors do not eagerly seek the industries that present the highest risks of loss combined with the lowest returns. Nor do workers, when they have any better alternative, go into industries where the wages are lowest and the prospects for steady employment least promising. If new capital and new labor are forcibly kept out of the X industry, however, either by monopolies, cartels, union policy, or legislation, it deprives this capital and labor of liberty of choice. It forces investors to place their money where the returns seem less promising to them than in the X industry. It forces workers into industries with even lower wages and prospects than they could find in the allegedly sick X industry. It means, in short, that both capital and labor are less efficiently employed than they would be if they were permitted to make their own free choices. It means, therefore, a lowering of production, which must reflect itself in a lower average living standard. That lower average living standard will be brought about either by lower average money wages than would otherwise prevail, or by higher average living costs, or by a combination